The sophomore Saudi plan is our story for today. The Saudi government is elected to generate an oil war, and that war is sort of shaping the entire market, is what we're focused on in this trade blast on the 18th. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks for joining us once again. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. Because of how busy things have been in the markets, we've kind of been doing a lot of stuff on Tesla, particularly as the stock price has been falling for a number of reasons. I've been having conversations with different people today about how the market was performing, and there's kind of a foundational discussion that I've wanted to sort of introduce that I think will help us all sort of position where we are and what's going to happen. So there is the issue of the coronavirus. We all know that that's the case, and it's working its way through in terms of how it's going to go. There's also another issue going on here, which is that the Saudi government sort of has led OPEC for a very long time, and kind of in consort with what was happening with the Soviets. The issue that kind of pops up, though, is that the frackers, because of their growth, have become the largest, sort of helped America to become the largest seller of oil, shipper of oil in the world, or producer slash exporter of oil in the world. So this has really upset the sort of order of things when it comes to oil. So I guess the Saudis slash Russians have been looking for a way to address this. By the way, I just wanted to note, thank you to our Patreon supporters as well as our subscribers. If you enjoy the show, please take time to like and subscribe. So this show really focuses on sort of establishing a structural space for where we are for the next couple of weeks until we see earnings from Tesla. As you note, as the market has been crashing, Tesla's stock price has been going with it, even though the news in general has actually been really good. So that's why I thought it made sense for us to take time out to figure out in general what's going on so we could position Tesla within that greater space. So I titled this the Saudi sophomore phenomenon. And the reason is that the new Saudi king is fairly young. And I first wanted to review in general some of the statements he's made from his behavior so we can get a feel for the fact that he's operating very differently than his predecessors have over the last 50 to 80 years. And then I wanted to sort of move into sort of where does this take us in the future. So the first part of this discussion is the fact that the Saudi king, upon entering, he made a move to actually try and imprison many of the sort of senior members of the Saudi family who might end up being rivals. And so there was an investigation of corruption, there was an imprisonment in the Ritz-Carlton in Saudi Arabia, and there were some other issues that popped up, but that seemed to die down systematically. The second thing that occurred was that he ordered the killing of a journalist who was critical of the Saudi government, and in particular, his ruling. And so, as you know, this was an unfortunate circumstance where the individual in question went to a meeting with the Saudi government to try to get some kind of a passport so he could get married. He was held in the Turkish embassy for Saudi Arabia. There was a hit team that was sent from Saudi Arabia that killed him and cut him up in pieces and took him, and we don't know what happened to him after that. Obviously, there was an outcry, but there was a sense that, okay, this is unfortunate. There was an outcry against it. There was some cry from the United States that more should be done than a warning and an outcry. And I think he calculated accurately that given that he controls the oil to the world, he could get away with it, which obviously he did. So that was kind of round two of seeing him in action. Round three, we've now entered, if you will, on a big scale. There are probably, I've heard of good things like there they're allowing women to drive in Saudi Arabia now, and other things that have sort of shown up that modernizes sort of the Saudi experience for its people. And so we're kind of having some other things happen. The IPO that Saudi Arabia did recently is another sort of change that was sort of on his watch. And then we finally come to now when we have this battle going between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and there's kind of a eye towards how can we jam the frackers. So the general idea of the downdraft in prices currently coming somewhat from Putin as well as from the Saudi government is that the fracking folks have begun to sort of dominate the production of oil globally. And there seemed to be a fear going on that that domination could grow to levels that are not healthy for the rest of OPEC. And so therefore, this is somewhat of a necessary evil. The idea behind what's going on right now is that there are various producers of oil that have a basic cost. So for example, there's a place called Canada. They rely in Alberta on something called the oil sands. But when they extract oil from those sands, their cost of doing so puts their barrel at somewhere around $50 a barrel. Maybe it's slightly lower than that. So when we're dropping down below towards 20, there's only, a few countries in the world, Saudi being one of them, whose sort of fixed cost on oil is in that $3 to $5 a barrel zone. And then you have transportation costs, et cetera. And so, one of our viewers from a friend of the show named Joey, who's based in Canada, was saying that we're in a tough spot because the Canadian dollar is actually falling against the American dollar, because the lower the oil price goes, they have to shut down all of the operations in Alberta. And oil is one of the largest exports that Canada has. So hence the Canadian economy gets its rear end kicked in by the low oil price, as does large numbers of companies in the United States who rely on the fracking to pay their bills. So the general idea is in Canada, the cost is maybe $50 a barrel. In the fracking world, it's maybe $45 a barrel, or 40 if they've been able to lower it. So the whole idea here is, can we get the price low enough that all of those entities are bankrupted and therefore can't come into the business? And then as soon as enough of them are bankrupted, the Saudis/OPEC retakes control, and they're able to raise prices to something that they want to do price-wise, knowing that the frackers are in such bad shape that they won't be able to re-enter the marketplace, in a strong way. So this is, I guess, kind of a good idea. Maybe not when demand for oil is falling so far, I don't think. But what's actually sort of jumping off out of this whole thing is the fact that all of the oil producers are losing a lot of money that would have made if they just let the prices float around where they were. And I would think, based on the fracking process, they would have continued to lose market share. I did find it strange the timing of them choosing to generate this war at such a bad time when demand is down dramatically, but perhaps they thought it was a good time. I really get the sense from the new Saudi king that I brought up the term sophomore because there are some people that are very clear on what they want to do, when, et cetera. And their process is, instead of asking an advisor, okay, if we do this, what happens? And then you sort of run those scenarios carefully. There are some folks that are like, hey, I want to go ahead and do it and just see what happens, and then we'll deal with the consequences afterwards. That's kind of in the sophomore zone that I was talking about. So what's happening right now is Saudi has done this IPO. Yes, they have sub $5 per barrel fixed costs, but they have variable costs like transportation. They also have the issue that they have a huge welfare economy. So the estimate that our friend from Canada had was that oil will fall to $12 a barrel. So I guess I was targeting below 20 because that's what Goldman Sachs said. But I can't argue with the whole idea of 12. And the reason is that once we get below 20, it's not like a car where you just put the brakes on and it stops at that number. that number could keep running southward. And sort of the two people that determine how then when that number stops dropping is really Russia and Saudi Arabia, because they have the lowest costs. So they have to determine when they're going to end the war between them. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is that one of the ways to get the same thing done that we're seeing right now would have been simply to have a meeting with the Russians, between the Saudi Arabians, and then pick the top half of the fracking community to bring into that meeting to have a conversation. So, at any rate, I just wanted to note that there's this sort of challenging circumstance that's going on where there are all these data points that are going on. And at the end of the day, because of how important oil is, so I've repeated several times that 25% of the market cap or companies, or oil-related companies, be it drillers, et cetera, et cetera. I actually read that number in the Wall Street Journal several years ago, but I've had a couple of people ask me, where do you get that number? That's where I got it from. If you want to do the research, fine. If not, that's your choice. But you can sort of look at adding up the market cap of the top oil companies, both domestically and international, and look at the percentage that they represent of the market cap of the global S&P, and it's actually a pretty large number. So the challenge is that while the oil companies themselves might be hurt on their earnings, there are also other issues that come up. For example, there are large numbers of banks that have huge loans out to these guys. And when those loans go under, you potentially jeopardize the health of those banks that are exposed there. And those loans are typically syndicated across large numbers of banks. So hence large numbers of them could get hit in terms of perhaps needing a bailout, et cetera. So even though those banks are not part of the oil community, they're part of the de facto oil community. So I'm running through all of this information because the 3-day rule, as it applies to 3 days in, what's going to happen with the big institutions, we're kind of entering that zone over the next day or two. And everyone's hoping that we get a bounce back and everything goes up. But the issue is we're now in a situation where there are a whole bunch of assumptions that analysts made by building the reports that gave us the higher stock price. Now that oil prices have fallen, all these analysts have to go back, rewrite the reports, hand them to the institutions. They do their 3-day plan before they start buying or selling. And I think, given where oil prices are going, they're going to start selling. So the thesis we had last night on this could get ugly, we could be limit down on the open, I think we probably have at least one more day, if not two, of this limit down process. And I really think that sort of the lack of command of what we're going to do during the virus period by Mr. Trump is going to actually influence this whole game as well. So it's an interesting time for the Saudis to pick a fight with the world when it comes to oil, because you already have low demand, prices are falling, et cetera. But in theory, it was going to happen sometime, and I guess their thinking is to do it now. And so the challenge that happens is that Tesla's a pretty big company market cap wise, but when the entire market is moving against it while it's doing well, that's how it flows. And then we add in the fact that Tesla, in theory, is shut down right now. I'm told Elon is sort of battling between the state and the county to determine if they can keep producing, but it seems like they'll be hard pressed to get the factory rolling again. And the factory is running. It hasn't fully shut down yet, but the thought process between the Fremont factory is that, and this is what I thought when I heard about it. I was like, wow, within, let's say, 3 miles of where they're located, Intel, there's like 20 global top 50, 80 companies that are located nearby, and all of them have had to shut down. So the question I was buzzing in my brain was, well, like, it's great that Elon has been able to keep going, but it may be in other counties, but nearby there are several other entities that are as big, if not bigger than Tesla, and they've had to shut down. So, it's an interesting sort of mix that we're dealing with right now because, yeah, Tesla in general is doing well. And in theory, I'm hoping they can maybe sneak by and battle the authorities to finish up these last 10 days of production before the end of the quarter. But even if they don't, I mean, they may or may not, I don't think they will, but they may be able to leverage their lawyer capabilities with their lobbying abilities, et cetera, to get the extra time that they need to finish out the quarter. We don't know what's going to happen. I think the likelihood is that it won't happen because Elon ends up in jail with the sheriff guiding him there. And so that ends that deal. The other problem is I actually read that, yes, the batteries are being produced at Giga 1 in Reno still, but there's also a question mark of whether or not they're going to get shut down because the casinos have been shut down in Nevada. And so there's a lot of shutdowns that sort of drive this whole process of what's happening. So my real goal of this conversation was to just, well, there's a gentleman who just left a note that his son works for Tesla, came to work and was sent home by his boss. So we're kind of feeling like, yeah, the shutdown is real. And then as we shut down, we just don't make our numbers for the quarter, and that affects earnings, et cetera, also affects the stock. So this is a long road to get over to what's going on at Tesla. One, without major news that's good, you can see the stock price continuing to fall, and 300 is an easy target for it to get there. Number two, we also have the problem of the Saudis are trying to choke out both the Russians and the frackers. And so while they're doing this, they're killing banks, they're screwing banks, they're screwing oil companies of all types. There's all these different, excuse me, all these different sort of moving parts, and pretty much all of them negative. So I would say that I just did a bouillabaisse or some gumbo from the United States, where you have all these little chunks of elements that go into the pot. And all those chunks seem to be toxic chunks that result in, an ugly situation that results in lower stock prices, people losing money in their 401ks, people losing their jobs as coronavirus forces shutdowns. All these different issues are sort of baked into this whole pot that we're brewing on. So what are conclusions one can draw from this? The big one I'm thinking about is if you don't have any puts or don't know how to trade options, at least, sell half your portfolio as a way to keep yourself somewhat in some cash, and then rebuy as the prices get lower instead of having to chase it down, without any hope of getting your money back immediately. The second thing to think about is that, Corona is really causing panic. And so that's another variable that's sort of sneaking into this whole party as well. And so, there's a lot of elements that have blended into this. And I wanted to cover that today because I'm talking with some of my trading buddies, and they're talking about, we're looking for our chance to get back in and we're ready to do it, et cetera. But between the panic of the coronavirus and then the Saudis trying to choke out the frackers, there are all these constituencies that are now below the hood that are creating sort of carnage. And it therefore makes it harder for the whole market to recover because you have all this destruction going on. And, how many different ways can you count it? Look at the stocks of the big banks. And then the Fed comes in and lowers the rates. So now this creates problems because the banks don't make as much money, with the lower rates. But also we have the issue of seniors relying upon fixed income elements that were paying decently before, heading down to nothing. So I'm wanting to just articulate what I see, and I'm happy to see someone say, Greg, you're wrong, let's go for the opposite of that, et cetera. The challenge, though, is, Bill just pointed out airlines and cruise lines are screwed. There's just, the list of screwed is just unbelievable. And so I just wanted to sort of give you guys a feel for how the vantage point looks and why. I see some opportunities there, mostly on the put side. For example, Joey, our friend from Canada, was talking about the Canadian dollar is going to get mashed. And so if you trade futures relative to currencies, I think with the oil prices low, Canada is in trouble. And the lower the oil prices get, the more in trouble Canada is. So therefore, that I think would be an excellent sort of currency play if that's something that you trade. Um, you know, I'm, obviously there's a whole bunch of other companies that and bad industries that are getting jammed right now that are tradable on the put side or down if you want to go there. Um, so at any rate, I want to, Sem just made a comment and we're kind of in our, respond to question zone where he was saying in 1 or 2 week things will better because Tesla report numbers and those numbers will help bolster the bottom end that we're seeing Tesla in right now. I think that in general that makes sense, but if they're unable to get the production done, it may not look as good, in a couple of weeks as we had hoped. So we're hoping that the high-priced lawyers of Tesla can win the day once again relative to keeping the factory open and making the numbers that they need to do to get to the end of the quarter. So, one of the things that's weird is that I always like to tell a story and then have like a happy ending. And to be honest with you, we're sort of stating the facts and you sort of can trade through those facts. But we thought it made sense to sort of set this up because as you see things falling apart over the next couple of days, it'll sort of give you a fundamental thought basis for how this is working and sort of why everything is sort of going where it is. Any rate, we've sort of fielded a question that folks have offered. Just a reminder, don't forget to get in 2 hours before going to bed, maximum 4 best, to not eating so that food can digest, number one. Number two, I want to encourage you to think about the 5-2 diet or one of the others relative to fasting for better mental health. Also wanted to encourage you on a 30 SPF or better to reduce the chance of skin cancer. We also wanted to note some weightlifting a couple of times a week. It's probably a good idea for bone density as you age. We also wanted to remind you to try maintain the same sleep schedule for a couple of weeks because your body appreciates being on a routine schedule. And I haven't been doing that because all this craziness has resulted in 2 a.m. shows for myself, but I'm getting back into the routine as well. At any rate, this is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. This has been our trade blast for this evening. Usually our trade blasts are early in the morning prior to market opening, but you can see we pretty much didn't need to wait until the morning to know we were going to be limit down yesterday. And I actually think there's a good chance we could go limit down again tomorrow. So, any rate, again, we look forward to your comments. Just a reminder, you'll get no more trade blasts this week if you're not a Patreon supporter, and we look forward to providing more information for those of you who are on the Patreon side of the house going through the rest of the week. And please take time to like and subscribe. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Tschüss, macht's gut, au revoir, licht rot, Choda Hafez, Farsi, Hejdo, Swedish, Zdravstvuyte, Russian, Ni hao ma, Chinese. Thanks once again, and we look forward to our next conversation.